You're hanging out in the House of Sunny podcast, where it's always sunny, mostly because of your host, comedian and YouTuber, Sunny Loman. Want to know what Sunny and her friends are thinking about this week? Well, here she is, Sunny Loman.
Hey, welcome everybody to the House of Sunny podcast. We have a special show today. We are welcoming once again real life historian Alexander Marriott to the show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And Doug's here, of course.
Of course. Where else would I be?
On today's show, we're going to talk about New York Times 1619 project because we're going to get educated by Alex about, I don't know what's right or what's wrong about the New York Times new project. If you haven't heard about it, the 1619 project is the New York Times has launched a series where we are redefining American history using slavery as the most important aspect of American history, and everything will revolve around that. And that is the New York Times vision for school children. We'll get into that. Alex, welcome. We're really glad to have you here, and we can't wait to hear your thoughts on 1619.
Right. I bet you didn't know that all of American history emanates from a ship, as the New York Times Magazine puts it in the very sort of stark black and white opening of that.
Are you talking about the Mayflower?
Yeah. Oh, no.
No, not that ship.
No. For as much importance as before I get into the details, I don't want to get lost in the weeds of my own thoughts yet. The New York Times Magazine, with some help from the Smithsonian. I know some people who work in the Smithsonian, so I'm trying to get the inside scoop as to how all of this is going over at the Smithsonian. Because the Smithsonian in the past has published some cautionary pieces about overemphasizing 1619, which is funny. If you can look these up on the internet, 2017 there was a piece by the Smithsonian Magazine about overdoing it on the whole 1619 thing. So it's interesting that 2 years later they are in conjunction with New York Times Magazine to do this whole project that is based on the year 1619. So we've gone from don't overdo it to, hey, we're going to overdo it with everybody else.
We're going to just totally overdo it. So what happened in 1619? Just what happened that they're very focused on?
So the story of 1619 is, in 1619, the Virginia colony has been going for 12 years. Jamestown has found success with the local Indians and with the local weather and climate to have a self-sustaining colony based on tobacco cultivation. And in 1619, unplanned, unbeknownst, nobody asked for this to happen, a Dutch vessel on the end of a long voyage that included selling slaves arrived at Jamestown and unloaded the remainder of its African cargo there, selling a group of slaves to some of the Jamestown colonists. Some of the others didn't actually end up in bondage for very long or at all. They entered the condition that most of the white inhabitants of Virginia entered as indentured servants, and ended up becoming free black people in Virginia. Eventually,
hey, Alex.
Anyway,
can you make that distinction for us, the indentured servitude versus slavery? Because I find that interesting.
So indentured servitude was how, here's problem one with focusing on 1619 to the exclusion of all else. Indentured servitude was how Virginia, for instance, populated its colony up until the 1670s and 1680s. Most of the labor done in the colony was done by indentured servants who were free people. That's the first distinction between an indentured servant and a slave. An indentured servant was a free person. But they signed a contract of indenture, right? So they agreed that they would be employed by whoever they were signing the contract with essentially without pay. And the pay would come in the form of room and board, and that sort of thing. You would essentially be living on this person's land and performing their agricultural or other labor for a set number of years, and that ranged usually from 4 to about 7, maybe a little longer or a little shorter, but those were the standard periods of indenture. And then once you were done, if you survived, and that was always the big thing in Virginia, lots of indentured servants just died in between. But if you survived to the end, the contract usually then included provisions for setting you up with your own land and some tools and some things to get started to build your own farm or your own plantation if you aspired to that sort of thing.
And those indentured servants were typically whites from Europe. Is that right?
Right. There were plenty of desperately poor people in England who even though they heard awful things, really, really awful stuff coming out of Virginia in the first 10, and then after 1622, when a major Indian War broke out, all that news, even with all that going on, just willing to sign these indenture contracts.
What's a chance at land ownership and something greater? I think, for an adventurous type, I could see doing that, even if, you take the risks. You're not there. You don't really feel the pain of it.
It also gives you an indication of just how terrible England was in the 17th century. Yeah. The opportunities in England were it was a period of transition for England, so there wasn't a lot of land opportunities, as Sonny just mentioned. There also wasn't a lot of great opportunities in any of the cities of England. I mean, there's a really good some of the really good literature on this talks about how when they counted people entering the city of London in any given year, there's tens of thousands of new people coming into the city. The population doesn't grow, of the city. They counted the other year, there's no population increase. So the question, of course, is, well, what happened? Well, they're all dead. They died. Yeah. So they came to the city looking for something and found nothing. So it was easy to go to the docks or, to those sorts of places on the coast of England and just find lots and lots of people willing to sign contracts and get out.
Cool. Okay. Slavery, on the other hand, is you are totally owned. No chance of, unless someone gets benevolent, lets you go, you're just owned.
Right. And that condition, obviously, far different. But in 1619, the reason why they're focusing on that is because this Dutch ship landed at Jamestown and sold a few slaves. And those are the first slaves documented in what becomes the United States, right? So that's their hook. Right. Now, in the Stark opening screen, they leave out the identity of the ship. It's just a random ship that arrives. It seems like this is kickstarting what we now know as slavery, but in point of fact, it really doesn't. This is not the beginning of a sustained series of voyages to come to Virginia and sell slaves. Up until the 1670s and 1680s, the vast majority of the labor in Virginia is still done by white indentured servants. For instance, by 1650, I think the number of slaves in Virginia was about 300. So this 1619, in point of fact, is not really the beginning of what they say. They say the beginning of American slavery. Now, American's kind of a big term. It encompasses more than just what becomes the United States. That's not accurate. It also isn't really the start of the slavery that we all sort of imagine is the slavery that exists in the United States. So those two elements are kind of just a little bit mistaken in the way they've set this up. Of course,
was it not the beginning of slavery as we came to know it? If a few slaves were purchased, why is that not the start of slavery in America?
So one of the things that's really, one of the things that they kind of talk about if you go to the project website, there's a very long sort of kickoff poetry, talking jam session that they do, and of course they have the. It's kind of funny in the sense that they have the white Jewish editor of the New York Times Magazine there, attempting to be hip and cool, and that he's down with the cause. He's incredibly out of place.
Cringy.
But he is definitely woke, as woke as he could possibly be. But anyway, it's a great question. And here's one of my complaints about this project, other than the really big claim of this is it. This is all of history. Everything should be centered around this moment.
Well,
and
that's
its consequences.
The really silly thing to me. But even if it was the start of slavery, what about the start of Jamestown being the beginning of American history? I mean, I could see making that argument, but just to focus on slavery is the only thing that ever happened in the United States, like ever. And that everything is about that and revolves around that is just, it really speaks to the mentality of these people who can't get their heads out of their asses, and they're obsessed with their race and slavery.
Well, fortunately, the fountainhead of this idea only says that 1619 is as important as 1776. I did not hear her say it was more important than 1776. Just as important. 1776. So
I read an excerpt. So her name is, what is her name? Let me just pull it out here just so we know who we're talking about. Her name is, the person who kind of spearheaded this whole thing is Nicole Hannah Jones. And I read a portion of her essay, and she talks about her dad flying an American flag and being really a patriotic man, and how she was embarrassed by that and felt that he was like a sucker, and like she talks about her feelings of hatred for this country, and the only way that she could possibly reconcile that for herself, with her dad and her own ability to like live in this country, I think even, was to tell herself that slaves built America.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's basically, it's like a psychological rationalization to help her sort of soothe and deal with these feelings that she has. That's what this whole thing is.
Right. She says in the, I think she says it in the essay too. She says in the video podcast that launched this thing that, there would not be a United States if not for slavery.
So this is like sweeping historical revision in the service of psychological therapy.
Yes.
That's what we're at now.
Yeah.
It does have that tinge to it, actually. I mean, she talks a lot about, and you often hear this when anyone comes forward with like a historical revision that is this total. I mean, this isn't just like a small, oh my God, we misunderstood, the sailing on the Mayflower. We've misunderstood everything. All of history is wrong. And whenever you hear somebody come forward with that, there's usually going to be these sorts of lines. I wrote this down as I was listening to her talk. She says, this history isn't taught. We don't learn this history. This is not what children learn in schools. I don't know what school. She's not that old. So I have no idea how she could have traversed school. And by the way, she'll contradict herself later in that opening by talking about how she in high school then opened a book. She was in high school and she was taking a Black Studies course. I don't know what high school she went to, but I went to a high school. I guess I'm the privileged white man. I went to a high school. There was no Black Studies course.
That's more of a college thing.
They didn't have that kind of specialized class structure at my high school.
Yeah, we didn't have that either.
And the book that she was assigned was it's funny that you brought up the Mayflower earlier, was a book by Lerone Bennett called Before the Mayflower. So she, in fact, did learn this history in school. And yet she's saying that we don't learn this history in school.
How else did she, as a young girl, hate the American flag and be embarrassed of her father, except to be sort of taught that by somebody in school?
Right. And here's the thing. This isn't all that new. What the new part of this is that the Smithsonian and the New York Times Magazine are involved in it. But Lerone Bennett
is the Pulitzer Center.
Right. right? That she's co-opted all of these other organizations into this. But Lerone Bennett is an old historian, sort of historian. He was sort of he's kind of widely mocked and laughed at by a lot of serious historians because he's so outlandish. Lerone Bennett is a person who in the 80s really pushed the Lincoln is as racist as any other Southerner that existed in the 1850s. There shouldn't be a reverence for Lincoln because he hated black people as much as Jefferson Davis or anyone else did. That's
Who cares
Lerone
what he
Bennett.
did? Who cares what he did?
Right, that's Lerone Bennett.
Yeah. What did he write in his diary on June 30th? 1854. Who cares what he did later?
Right. And of course, it's just a misread of lots of things. And even historians who are sympathetic to, I think, probably this project, had to take Lerone Bennett to task as far as, you're decontextualizing the quotes you're using. You're not being honest in your presentation of material, to the extent that they did. Historians even in the 80s were feeling this sort of uncomfortableness of correcting a fellow historian who happened to be black, in this case Bennett. And that's certainly going on here. The sort of, the silence. One of the things that's remarkable about this rollout is that they have poets, they have journalists. I mean,
it's massive.
You undersold Nicole Hannah-Jones, Sonny. She's a genius. She got a MacArthur Genius Grant. Those are the people who are all on the stage. There's not one historian on the stage. There's the only historian they brought in was a brief curatorial examination of some artifacts from a Smithsonian.
I was going to say, doesn't the Smithsonian, isn't it chock full of historians?
And yet none of them seem to have anything to do with writing up the intro or anything like that. So like I said, I suspect... So
it's almost like politically they slapped their name on it, like some higher up slapped their name on it, but they didn't really get involved.
Well, here's the thing. The Smithsonian now includes an institution that may find itself sort of captured by the people involved in this project. And of course, I refer to the Museum of African American Culture and History. That's part of the museum system in D.C. And I think the woman they had who, by the way, I don't have any objection to anything she said or did. This woman from the museum who was talking about the objects. But I think that might be part of it in terms of, because like I said, in 2017, the same institution said focusing on 1619 is actually distorting and misleading. And I would agree with that it is distorting and misleading, that you don't really get to sort of understand how and why slavery developed as it did, or even when it did, if you focus on 1619 so much.
So before we get into the facts of that, I don't know if you saw, and this maybe explains why there's no historian involved in this, they don't really believe in history. I mean, I don't know if you saw some of this, but I was looking at the materials that the Pulitzer Center provided for the 1619 project. This is for teachers, elementary, junior high, high school teachers, okay? And I'm looking over this stuff, and they keep saying the following term over and over. National memory. That's what they're sort of substituting for history. And there are questions in here for kids that say this. Here's a suggestion, one of the suggested questions to go with this 1619 project. What is national memory? How do we create it? How can we change it?
Right.
So really, this is overt historical revisionism. I mean, they know that what they're saying isn't right, but they're changing national memory. That's what they're doing.
Well, they certainly want to. I mean, I was impressed on a level by the extent of the ambition of this project. That not only did it come out with the fancy launch and the the sort of the breathless video of that, and all the articles and the magazine devoted to it, and geniuses being brought in to run it and that sort of thing. But the whole curricular mock-up they had done for all the things that people could do. And of course, it goes way beyond 1619. It goes to the entire experience of the United States and how we as a people, I mean, that's how ambitious it is. We as a people in the future, you can imagine if this was completely successful 100 years from now, you'd ask a standard American on the street, what's the most important aspect of what defines you as an American? And the answer would be from everyone.
Slavery.
Asians who arrived in the late 19th century and their descendants, Italians who arrived in the 20th century and their descendants, they'd all say slavery, that slavery was the quintessential defining characteristic of the nation. And I mean, we get into the kind of the weird turning everything not only on its head, but then going into the bizarro land beyond it. Because Nicole Hannah-Jones also said that it's black people who have fought more than anyone else to make America wealthy, to make it free, to perfect
the ideas.
Yes, to perfect all these ideas, to make them true, and to create everything that anyone admires about American culture. It sort of reminds me of the of what for a while was a thing I heard a lot of gay people say in terms of going through history and saying, what about Michelangelo? Oh yeah, he was gay. Right, every great historical figure. Oh no, they were. That was a gay guy. That was a gay woman. All these things were produced by homosexuals, as opposed to, okay, was he really? I mean, what's the evidence for that? It reminds me a little of that whatever your sort of historical hobby horse is, that now everything is that. Everywhere you look, you see that, as opposed to looking at things on their own terms, which is what historians, at least in history classes that I've been in, now they could all be changing. They might all decide to become 1619 project oriented, but you're supposed to look at things as they were in the context of their times, and not try to take things from today and impose them on the past. But maybe Alex, we'll get away from that.
That's exactly, there's the actual factual aspect to this of what really happened and whether this is all true. But the more important aspect of this to me seems to be not only the historical revisionism in service to this contemporary left-wing politics, but also this methodology, this historian's methodology, whereby, this memory idea, this, idea that we're supposed to go back and rather than understand historical figures contextually, we're supposed to take contemporary or fashionable left-wing mores and then apply that as some sort of binary good or bad stamp to historical figures, so that everything now is meant to serve, your psychological guilt or your own self-esteem as a member of a favored group or a victim group, or to serve some political end now, in terms of, like the Cultural Revolution in China, where you tear down all these cultural heroes and standards to replace them with, contemporary political ideology. So there's that to me is the scarier thing almost than just even going through the revisionism that's going on, is what this tells us about where the humanities are at and what these people are really trying to do in terms of like re-educating and revising our entire culture and tearing down our culture.
I think it might. The fact that there are no, I still haven't seen any. I'm not saying there are none. There may be some that emerge in the coming weeks, but the fact that right now there aren't any major historians of American slavery involved in this, as cheerleader. Well, they may be cheerleaders, but as participants and contributors, I think is a wake-up call to to the academy in general as to what exactly has been going on in all these enclaves that have been created, the sort of ethnic studies departments that exist.
Yeah.
And Lerone Bennett is one of those pioneers. So the fact that she brought him up by name, I thought was important and consequential. Is probably why we won't end up seeing too many historians, and it's why we won't hear the historians, by the way, fight back in any way, because like I said, frankly, I think most of those historians are white men and white women and are afraid of being called a racist.
Yeah, they're afraid of being called a racist. They're afraid of losing their jobs. And that's a very real fear, because if you speak out against these SJW victim-obsessed people, they come after you. They try to get you unemployed. And you're working for institutions that lean in their direction, if not, are completely in that direction anyway. I don't know how you find it, but I mean, it's pretty clear that it's.
I think there's a range. You're not going to find too many colleges that lean right or libertarian. You'll find obviously more that lean actively in this direction. But there are a lot of colleges that are kind of like your standard corporation. They just don't want the headache. They don't want the trouble.
Yeah.
Or any kind of controversy that gets in the way of anyone making decisions.
That is the serious problem in this country. It's not so much these assholes. It's the lack of speaking out. So these people come out with this completely messed up version of history with a bad methodology and everything else, and no historians backing them up. And what does your profession do? They're not like you said, where are the historians at the Smithsonian who just 2-3 years ago were saying this is not a valid theory of history, of American history? Where is that guy? And they're so afraid to speak out. And as a result, these sick Marxists are ruining our society and indoctrinating our children.
Well, I wouldn't even. I mean, say what you want about Marx, but at least he proffered some sort of logical ethos in his own way. This is my attempt to commune with the Big Lebowski. But
say what you want
I wouldn't even
Marx.
I wouldn't even call them Marxists because I mean that Maoist might be the right term. I think Doug's onto something there,
Yeah.
But because. In a goofy sort of way, one of the things that they want to claim credit for slavery and for black people generally is capitalism, right? And its success. They want to say that the America becoming the economically powerful, dominant place that it became was all due to slavery. Now there are
slavery was everywhere. So
well, yeah, you would wonder why Brazil didn't become the dominant place, because slavery lasted longer
there. Yeah, right.
Why didn't Africa become the dominant power? Because that's who was the originators of the slave trade.
So well, that would be an interesting thing to ask one of those. Now there are some historians who've done that recently. There's been three major historical treatises actually that have supported that thesis in various ways. But I didn't even see them in that first issue. So either I suspect that maybe there was a decision made to put forward the most provocative pieces that talk about how Atlanta's traffic problems are slave based, and things like that.
Wait, what?
Oh yeah, look through the magazine. Look through the magazine.
There was an article that Mitch McConnell this was hearkening back to slavery, right?
Wait. Back up. Did somebody
Senator
say Atlanta traffic is a result of slavery?
Well, Jamel Bowie argued that the debt ceiling crisis of 2011 and Mitch McConnell's use of the filibuster can be traced directly back to the antebellum South.
Right. So again, that you're in the throes of the great realization, right? This happens sometimes in the way history is presented. Somebody has some sort of fantastic, what they believe is some sort of fantastic insight about, oh my God, I've unlocked the sort of the secret to all historical events, right? Now, in this case, Marx is a good comparison, right? Marx believed he did that when he sort of put forward this idea that class, is the sort of great secret of how things happen, right? And how history moves. It's all through class. So you could explain everything through class. And in this case, they believe they've discovered the act. You can describe and explain everything through slavery and race. That is sort of the key to understanding every problem. So you get these absurd articles about Atlanta's traffic. That could be explained through slavery and race. Mitch McConnell and the filibuster and the debt ceiling argument in 2011. That's slavery and race.
Or like something happens and you're just thinking, how is this related to slavery and race? Like that's where you go with it. And, when I'm looking at these materials for these teachers, one of the things that struck me was they have these worksheets that the kids are supposed to fill out. And they answer a question, okay, what was Nicole's point about, what was the point she was making here? And you fill that in and then you say, and then the next question is, what is the evidence for that? And you fill that in. There's no box for evidence against. Like,
of course,
it's just evidence for. I mean, you couldn't design.
Sonny, you didn't learn critical thinking as simply writing up what somebody's opinion was and how they justified it, and then moving on. That wasn't your critical thinking training.
Yeah, right. I mean, I just thought, wow, that is so transparently indoctrination. Just to say, okay, now we're going to go out and look for all this evidence that it's true, what she's saying. And you're just learning how to indoctrinate yourself.
But that's history as a method, and as a science. That what is so disturbing to me about this trend is that, even if we, you can debate the facts, we can find new sources of evidence. I mean, it's essentially like history is a science, and these people, it's not. It's obviously just a propaganda effort to in service of a political agenda.
Right. I think. I mean, that's a prevalent idea in the academy generally. That all humanities, particularly those that deal with describing the past or evaluating economic or political systems or philosophical ideas, that those are all contests for power. And because they're contests for power that white men have been winning for several centuries, that other people should enter the arena and win them instead. And I think this is a fairly bold and obvious effort of doing that.
At one time I said, when I, kind of cheekily, that the only white privilege is growing up without this stick up your ass. And that truly is white privilege. I actually feel really sorry when I'm reading this warped essay this woman wrote about how she was embarrassed for her father who flew the American flag and loved his country in spite of slavery. Obviously, he's focused on other things. And the promise of this country and how lucky he is to be here, which he is. Anyone would trade places with her, with her dad.
Right.
We're 3% of the population. Think of all the people who would trade places with either one of them to be here in America.
Yes.
And he understood that, and she doesn't. And she's so full of anger, and she's just got that huge chip on her shoulder. And just imagine walking through life where everything you see through the color of your skin and through the to use their words, the lens of racism and slavery. I mean, you must be the most miserable assholes to walk the earth. And I feel really bad for them because a lot of this is just they're getting it from their teachers. They're getting indoctrinated. And I mean, not just this woman. She's obviously evil because she's part of it now. But the poor kids, the poor black kids that are being raised with this idea that nothing is their fault, that everything is slavery, that, any obstacle they run into is white people, is this institutionalized racism and slavery in their past, and how awful, how psychologically crushing that attitude is.
Right. I mean, the irony here is that her father sounds like a sort of
Cool
a
guy.
plain and simple American, a hardworking guy who
Right.
did everything he could to make sure that his daughter got ahead in life, sent her to a good school that had specialized coursework in high school.
Yeah, right.
And ironically, turned her into a very bitter and angry person,
Right.
who can only find redemptive value in the American past if she can distort it all through the lens of slavery and the triumph of the enslaved people and their descendants to get out of it. Which, by the way, is a great triumphant story. It's part of the American story, and it's taught everywhere. There's no school in this nation that doesn't teach it, and teach it with the implicit. Nobody teaches this history anymore, and hasn't for at least 30 or 40 years, if not more, without the implicit message being the slaves are the sort of victimized heroes who triumph in the end of this. So the idea that this isn't being taught, what she objects to is that it's not being taught to the exclusion of everything else.
Right.
And that's just weird. You shouldn't want it to be taught to the exclusion of everything else.
So it's two things. She wants a fake history taught, a fake history that makes slavery something more than it was. And then on top of that, she wants it to be the only thing that we think about when we think about America. So in other words, we hate America because there's nothing good about it, because it was just gross and all about nasty,
she says there are
acts.
good things. There are good things, right? But they're all related to the triumph of black people over this. I mean, when you get down to it, she's positing there's no other word for it, a fairly racialized view of what's good and bad in America. She says America was founded on an idea and a lie.
Yeah.
Right. And she says the idea was good, but because it was undergirded with a lie, the hypocrisy of the people who still own slaves, Jefferson, for instance, that it could only be redeemed by Jefferson's slaves. They're the only ones who could make it real. And therefore, they're the only ones that really, at the end of the day, are the admirable characters in this story. Because without them, it would still be a lie. Right.
Did you watch Dave Chappelle's new comedy special?
Oh, not yet. I plan to.
So there's
I've
one
heard
joke
but
in
interesting
there.
things.
Well, it's great. But there's one joke in there where he says he's going to do an impression of the Founding Fathers. And then he says, "Hey there, N-word. Are you done with the Constitution yet?" Like his slave wrote the Constitution. It's funny.
Right.
But that's kind of like, this woman takes that seriously.
Right. Not in as literal a way, but certainly in as real a way, right? That she thinks it's a very obvious connection. I don't think she'd be. I think she'd be offended by Dave Chappelle, but I don't think she'd be off put by that idea.
Yeah, right. Well, so let's get into some of the details of the history that she has wrong. So, when did slavery start in America, if not 1619?
Right. So way back when, you asked me that question earlier because I said that's not really a good representation of slavery as we know it. The reason why I said that is that slavery as it exists in the colonies that get started in the early and mid 17th century is kind of like I said, it's kind of an ad hoc sort of thing. And the reason why is because that Dutch ship, let's use the 1619, the White Lion, this Dutch vessel that shows up in Jamestown, this was really the last stop. This was sort of hey, there's one other little settlement we've heard of. Let's see if we can sell the rest of our stuff and go back to Europe to start over again, or get out of this voyage altogether. And that's really how North America was seen by almost everyone for a long while in the 17th century. It's kind of a backwater. There's not really a whole lot going on. Nobody really has anything or wants very much because there's not that many people there. And certainly when you talk about the transatlantic slave trade, it was seen as the sort of the last place you go. It's sort of nobody will buy whatever cargo I've got left in the Caribbean, which is where all the action is. I'm basically going to sort of take a gamble and sail north before I turn with the winds back to Europe. And that's really what's going on. So slavery in a place like Virginia is not an institution that is economically all that important, because there are not that many slaves. And it's also not an institution, here's the interesting bit, it's also not an institution that has all of the strict racial features and color lines and barriers that we think are sort of quintessential to American slavery. So for instance, some of those people who were sold in 1619, some of the people who got off the ship in 1619 weren't slaves, right? They ended up as indentured servants and then ended up being free in the colony. There ended up being a free black population, a small one, in the colony of Virginia fairly rapidly. Some of them ended up owning property. Some of them ended up owning indentured servant contracts. Some of them ended up owning slaves. And we know this because we still have some of the court records from that period in which a very famous example, a man named Anthony Johnson, is seen suing his white neighbor and winning his case in a Virginia court. So we have and there's also marriages that are going on. There's intermingling that is going on, recognized legal marriages between blacks and white people in colonial Virginia in the early 17th century. So there's all these things that are happening that don't really conform to anything that we think of as standard American slavery. So to date in 1619 just misses all of that. You sort of erase, ironically enough, you erase a bunch of history that is evocative and interesting and tells us something about how slavery evolved, how race and racism evolved, because those concepts that we think are we for some reason think are timeless don't really exist in the form that we're used to seeing them.
That's
in
interesting.
The early 17th
I'm not
centuries.
aware of that. That's really interesting. I wonder how it ultimately did develop then, that there were these sort of class lines based on race.
Well, it's an interesting
was that a Southern
story.
thing only, or was it that way in the North
No,
too?
it was started in the North.
This is an evolving idea that slavery would exist legally in all of the colonies. So there would be, the very famous example that most people listening would be familiar with is the Paris household in Salem Village, right, where the witchcraft starts. The very first person that everyone turns to when the girls start misbehaving and acting weird is Tituba, the West Indian slave who lives with the Parises and takes care of the children. That's in Massachusetts, right? So these expectations or ways of dealing with slaves who are racially distinct, these evolve in colonial thought up and down the seaboard and even back in England over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. And of course, this has all been documented. We have these histories. This was all done, this sort of detective work, reconstructing all this in the 1960s and 1970s. So for Nicole Hannah-Jones to claim that these things are just nobody knows this stuff, nobody talks about it, it's not taught anywhere, is just a tremendous, bizarre disservice to all the really hard work and all the really great history writing that happened at this point 50 years ago, and that has, formed the basis of a lot of great history writing and a lot of further insights ever since. But yeah, so the sort of slavery she, I think, wants us to think about, really, we don't see that in Virginia until the 1670s and 1680s.
That's a lot. That's a long time from 1619.
Right, because it's at that moment that the colony begins to shift away from indentured servants, and as soon as there starts to be thousands and thousands of African slaves, then we start to see laws being changed to sort of put in place rules about social intermixing and sexual intermixing and travel and property ownership and all sorts of other things that we tend to think are the quintessential features of American slavery.
And now, by the time of the founders, I sort of have this idea, and maybe this is wrong, that some of my reason for sort of excusing their slave ownership was they seemed to be against it, like Jefferson, Washington, but they were also kind of worried about what freedom did to some of the black people that were raised as slaves. Like as if they weren't capable of being free. And if you think about how the country started, where black people were free, it was obvious that they could be free from the beginning.
So, again, this is an interesting story. I think Doug alluded to the ubiquity of slavery, right? That this is an institution that exists on every continent at every time at
with
one
every
point or
race.
another. With every race and in between races. One of the questions that always comes up with students who read, I have every student read a chapter from Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative, the Middle Passage chapter, I think it's chapter 2, a very famous accounting of what the Middle Passage was like. And one of the questions that students invariably ask is, why do Africans enslave their own people? Why does that happen? And one of the things I try to get them to think about with the Africans as with the Indians is that those terms that we use that are very convenient terms, Indians, Africans, to refer to a racial or ethnic group of people that we need to talk about in shorthand, those words don't exist for people who live in Africa
right.
and people who are in Indian tribes.
Right.
They don't think in their universe in those terms. They think, then use Europe as an example. They think, the same way Europeans do. If I'm a Frenchman, I'm not German. I'm willing to kill a German at any point in most of European history because they're Germans. They're not Frenchmen, right? Even though we all live in Europe together and we could all be called Europeans by somebody else.
Right.
But they're not me, and I will kill them if I have to, right? Or if we need to. And that's sort of the same. That's the same way in which Indians and Africans operated with each other. They're not me, this group of people. They live next to me. We go to war with them. If I capture them in war, they will be my slave. And that's just the way it's going to be. And then I can use them to my advantage in one way or another.
And Alex, there's a great historian, John Thornton, who wrote some seminal books on the history of the African slave trade that I've been reading, and points out exactly what you're saying, which was West Africa at that time was just dozens and dozens of warring kingdoms.
Right.
And these kings would either through war or even through judicial proceedings, if you were found guilty of something or another, you could be sent into slavery. Or if they conquered, their neighboring tribe, they would sell the conquered into slavery to the Europeans in exchange for weapons or other goods that they wanted from them. And so this was not controversial at all really at that time, and in fact it was done with the full participation, and couldn't have been done without the full participation of the African kingdoms at that time.
Right. If when the Portuguese began developing trade connections on the coast of the west coast of Africa, that eventually will become the basis of the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, if the reaction had been a unified one of death to all Portuguese traders who arrive on the shore, then there wouldn't have been a transatlantic slave trade, at least not in the shape that it took. Because it would have been impossible to ever foster any of the trade relationships upon which it was based, and it was a trade relationship. I mean, all those coastal kingdoms and polities were trading for European goods. They wanted guns and European manufactured items in exchange for these captive people that they sold into slavery. So the I mean, that history is also lost here. I mean, the one thing that's ironic about all this is that with all of the knowledge we have, which is great, by the way, this is one of the things that's really great about what history has done in the last 30 or 40 years in terms of widening this story to compare it to all the other kingdoms and empires that existed, to bring in the Africans part of the story, which is fascinating and interesting. This project loses all of it. It blots it all out. The focus on 1619 and the arrival in Jamestown, as if that voyage was all that important in the context of 1619, and it's not. It's not an important voyage at all.
Yeah.
You lose all of those other context, all of that other really fascinating history that helps you sort of understand what the world of the 17th century was like, and how people could think that these things were normal and perfectly reasonable ways to act. All of that's gone. It's just gone.
And in fact, I mean, when you think about white indentured servitude, and you think about the way in which the African kingdom sold, their neighbors into slavery, I mean, was there anyone that was free at this time? I mean, other than the kings and the aristocrats who, lorded over the subjects in the feudal system. And I mean, no one was free. I mean, that's why these people are going to the New World to begin with.
Right. The idea of freedom, the idea of being a completely unencumbered person was such a rarity in most of the world that those places that had developed it by this point, and there aren't that many of them, they're mostly cities. Cities often were considered places where people were free. That's part of the reason why cities were a sort of an odd place in this moment in the 17th century in Europe. They were looked at askance by most monarchs because they had all these people in them that were free. You could tax them. That was the benefit of having them there. But they could also be trouble, right? If you did something that the city didn't like, it could be a lot of people who'd get in your way and cause mischief for you. But in those places that had become recognizably in some sort of way to us free, but in the 17th century, yeah, they're very rare. They exist in a few urban centers here and there, in weird places in Europe. So the Netherlands will be one of them, and England will have the beginnings of rumblings of this in its urban communities as well, that will eventuate in a revolution by the end of the 17th century, where freedom really does become the basis of some kind of English or British citizenship. But yeah, this was one of the great things, one of the great books. If anyone really wants to dive into this and see the development of race and slavery and how it happened in the 17th century, is a book called American Slavery, American Freedom by Edmund Morgan. And in that book, he traces, among many things, but he traces this general sort of the rough world of the 17th century, just bringing you back to how people treated each other. And he's talking at the beginning of that book about how white people treated each other, what we would consider to be racially similar people. If race is all that matters, he shows you that at the beginning of the 17th century, race didn't mean jack shit, right? That,
interesting.
That English people his example is rampaged over Ireland without a second thought.
Right.
The Irish were.
And colonized that island in ways that would set them up for colonizing elsewhere, and gave them a cultural sort of memory of, when you need to do something as a people, if you're going striking out new places, you need to fight against others to move them along, then you could burn down their village and kill everybody. That's an effective way of sort of making your point and doing what you need to do. If somebody needs to be your indentured servant for 7 years, that's better than killing them. So they should be happy that you're doing that to them, right? All those sorts of things. The world of the 17th century is a different world than the world of today. And one of the things that is interesting about studying history properly and sort of appreciating it for its complexity is that you sort of get that impression. And I think, ironically, Nicole Hannah-Jones's father probably had that in a rudimentary level, which is why he could raise the flag at home and be a patriotic guy and realize, for all the flaws of his own, that he saw in America while he was alive. It's not like this man had his eyes closed while he lived his life in the United States. He got to see horrible things happen to people, not just black people, but to people, right? But he also got to see things get better. Right? He got to see things change. He got to see people who weren't like him, right, be on the same side as him, right? And that's one of the things that's interesting about the United States, 160 years after 1619. You get to 1776, and a guy like George Washington or a guy like Thomas Jefferson, who had grown up in a society that took slavery and racial hierarchy for granted in the 18th century, could suddenly start to think, maybe there's something wrong about it, right? Maybe there's something that I need to be uncomfortable with when it comes to that institution. And they do make that acknowledge,ment right?
Well, and at the same time, Britain is outlawing slavery in the late 1700s, and the U.S. is outlawing the international slave trade in the early 1800s. And so it's, in America and the West, we're moving towards outlawing slavery. And at the same time, slavery is still going on full bore in Africa. And they're not exactly all for ending slavery because they're making money from it. Right. So isn't it the West and our more liberal notions of, equality and that actually ends slavery?
And it's not just slavery, but I think the point is that the context is that it's only really this country and enlightened England and Europe that people actually ever did eventually become free. And that at the time, it was pretty brutal life, unless you were born privileged.
It's like in an airplane when they tell you to put your oxygen mask on first before helping other people. I mean, we have to unshackle ourselves from monarchy, and we set this country in motion. And then, you start to see all these dominoes fall. Now we're at the point where we look, by virtue of the fact that we enjoy freedom, we can now look back and say, well, because they didn't do it sooner or didn't figure it out or didn't fight these wars, a war for independence even sooner, that we should chastise these people and denigrate them. I mean, that's such a context drop.
Right.
They're lucky that they live in a free society. And
we all are.
Yeah, we all are. Exactly. That's my point. They are, we are, I'm grateful. And they're not. They see it as this really horrible place. And they have lost. The only reason that they could see it that way is by losing the rest of world history and the rest of the history, the context that you're saying. The only way that you could see it this way is to drop all of that other information.
Right. And I think you may have hit part of this earlier with the sort of you don't ever want to psychoanalyze somebody from afar, but but reading the biographical the autobiographical vignette that she wrote about her dad and her feelings.
She
about
makes a big confession there.
And
very revealing.
Yeah, right. And that sort of thing can, be a tremendous motivator to do stuff, right? And in her case, it's to do this, right? To try to try. I think in her own way, I think she believes quite firmly that if this becomes the way in which we all see the past, we all think of ourselves as Americans, I think she really does believe that this then becomes the way in which she, as a much younger person, could have been proud of the United States.
Right. And of her father.
Right.
Yes.
And so I think in that respect, she believes she's doing some sort of yeoman service for creating a real and authentic and true patriotic story that Americans should be hanging their hat on.
It's a hell of a lot less inspiring and interesting than the real story.
I think she thinks it's pretty inspiring. In its own way, right? I think what's missing or what's wrong with it is that it ironically distorts the very thing that she thinks she's putting front and center. It distorts and truncates and kind of triumphalizes in a weird way the very history she wants front and center. And that's just a weird side effect of what she's doing. And of course, then it also minimizes or destroys or completely obliterates lots of other history that she doesn't want to emphasize or she doesn't want to be the focus anymore. And that's problematic, to say the least.
But, you know, if not for just this one, I mean, it's not just this one woman, because she couldn't get away with it if this wasn't a trend throughout the academy. So, you know, what explains this larger mission or methodology, as it were, to look at history in this way, to distort history for either a political agenda or as a means to some sort of like psychotherapy or, you know, a comforting way to think about or rationalize your own failure? You know, like what is that? What's been going on for the last 30 or 40 years here that's enabled this?
Well, here's the weird thing. I mean, I alluded to this before. Historians of these actual subjects do not approach them in the way that she approaches this.
It's the studies. It's the diversity studies.
I think it's historians and academia in general in the 70s conceded to activist scholars the idea that there should be a protected enclave for, you know, it was the first safe space, so to speak, for radical ethnic studies as a discipline.
Not just ethnic, because there's women's studies, and so it's
gender,
it's just victim
gender
studies, I guess.
Yeah.
And
Jordan
Peterson has talked about this a lot. He thinks that is the cancer in the universities.
Yeah, in those places, I think that's when we talk about Nicole Hannah-Jones as a genius, she's not a genius in the history realm. Like I said, when I looked through the authors here, I didn't see any recognizable historian involved in this. But I imagine these people are recognizable in the African American studies realm. And that's just not a universe historians live in. I mean, it's weird. Academia created those enclaves as a sort of way to assuage guilt, but then they sort of never interacted with them. They never brought them in to criticize their ideas or anything. And again, that has to do with not wanting to be called bigoted. You know, so there's that. I mean, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer for you, Doug.
That is a satisfying answer, because it's a cultural problem that everybody's running around scared of being called bigoted to fight back against these crazy lunatic SJWs in every subject, in every realm, you know, whether it's social media or whatever. Everybody's backing down because they're so afraid of being called a racist or a xenophobe or whatever. And that is really the problem of our day, and I don't think it's going to get solved until people of all colors are willing to stand up and go, all right, fine, I'm a racist. At least I care about truth, you know?
I look forward to that meme campaign when people start posting their mouth duct taped with "I'm a racist" on it.
Whatever. I mean, obviously we're not racist, but my point is that we have to stop being afraid of it. We have to.
But the real historians
how do you get over the fear of the label, except to just be like, fine, if you want to call it, fine. I'm fine with it. Call me a name. As long as we're talking about truth, that's all that matters. And you just have to ignore the slurs, I guess. But a lot of people have to start standing up. And shame on the Smithsonian and shame on the Pulitzer Center. We expect this kind of shit from the New York Times after last year's expose on how great communism is. So this to me is just more of that. And New York Times sold their soul a long time ago.
Yeah, the New York Times Magazine, as best I can tell, is a weird cesspool of goofballs that couldn't make it into the actual New York Times. So I guess it just does these weird sort of woke social justice warrior projects now. For lack of a better term.
It is going to have an impact. This is going to get picked up. Teachers are going to take these materials into their classroom and teach their kids this. So everybody out there listening, if you have children or grandkids or whatever, you have to counter this, or if your schools start dealing with this, you got to go in and speak out and say this isn't right. This is anti-American. This is not historical. This is not run by historians. I think that's an interesting fact. There is no historians anywhere around this. I think that is a really interesting fact. And you can go to your schools with that information and say, you know what, I will trust the historians over these diversity activists.
Here's the rub, Sonny. You bring up a great point. I mean, the way in which we train teachers in college is not in the history department to teach history, right? It's in the education department or education program of most colleges. So teaching history is managed by a person with an education degree who will take this, right? This will be a great way for you to do this.
The New York Times says it's great. The Smithsonian says it's great. The Pulitzer Center. These are all reputable organizations. And they don't know enough to know it's BS. So I hope they're paying attention out there. Yeah, or they don't care. They're just looking for a way to not have to do any work and shove these worksheets out at their kids. So
well, here's the scary part. When they go to the interview and they say when they get asked the question, well, how would you teach slavery in your class? And they pull this out of their toolbox and say, well, I would use these resources from the Pulitzer Center, the Smithsonian about teaching 1619 and blah 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 blah. You'll get two reactions from the hiring committee. One will be, oh, look at how with it this person is. They're really up to date on what's going on. And I heard Smithsonian. Ooh, that sounds interactive, and students won't have to read old dead people and what they had to say about stuff. And the other group of people on the hiring committee will be, oh no, I can't possibly object to this in the committee later on because I'll be perceived as not with it or racist or unhip or something. So it's almost diabolical the way it's been set up. Almost.
Yeah, you're in the committee and you say, this is BS. And they say, this is the New York Times and the Smithsonian. Who are you? I mean, seriously, I think this is horrible. This is going to be a really big problem. This is going to get taught. And in 20 years, every kid is going to say 1619. This is sick.
Certainly the goal. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, that ends our show for today. All right, everybody, fight it. Speak out. Who cares what they call you? That's the key. That is the key. We have to speak out. If your kids are in school, speak out. Don't let them do this. This is BS. You heard it here from a historian, a real historian who works at a university, is a professor, has studied history his whole life. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, and say that book again, the one that people should read for an accurate history of this period.
So if it's How Slavery Developed in Virginia, it's American Slavery, American Freedom by Edmund Morgan. If they want to dive deeper into how race evolved, there's a great book called White Over Black by Winthrop Jordan. And just briefly, I'm a historian. You let me plug a book. I'm going to plug more than one. David Bryan Davis, who recently passed away, wrote a magnificent three installment, because it's a big question, a big subject, 3-installment a series of books on the question that Doug brought up earlier. How is it that slavery, this universal ancient institution, finally started to be questioned and challenged when it was, and how it was abolished, at least in the Western world. So if anyone's interested in some actual sort of food for thought and historical writing of the best sort and of the greatest kind, those would be the places I would start.
And I'm not a historian, but there's another book, Alex, that this Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, 1400 to 1800 by John Thornton. That's the book
I know that book too. That's a good book as well.
I just hope that we get some historians writing some pieces that are counter to this, because really that is the only thing that you could take to a committee meeting and try to get people to read, regarding these schools and what's happening in the classrooms and stuff, or give it to your teachers, give it to your history teachers in your kids' school, some sort of counter narrative to this that that points out the flaws in this project. It's just unbelievable how vast and how well supported it is. Anyway, thanks for coming on, Alex, and talking to us about it. This has been a great show, really informative, and I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me and letting me gas on about it. So.
All right, bye, everybody. Thanks for listening to the House of Sunny podcast. We are completely fan-funded, so we need your support. Look for House of Sunny at subscribestar.com to sign up to be a member of my elite squad, or you can go to houseofsunny.tv and make a one-time PayPal donation. Thank you.